In order to develop the normative concepts to judge whether monopoly is better than competition or not, and to make other kinds of value judgments about economics, we need to be able to answer the question, how much is, for example, Q1 units of a commodity really worth to the consumers? In other words, how much would they be willing and able to pay for Q1 if they had to? In answering this question, I'm not discussing how much they'd have to pay for Q1 if there's competition, or how much they'd have to pay for Q1 if it's being supplied by a monopolist. What I'm trying to get at is, in trying to think of any kind of situation that would lead to the maximum amount of money voluntarily transferred by consumers in return for the privilege of getting Q1 units of this commodity. Now, as you all know, the demand curve is determined by consumer preferences and also budget constraint. So we're always talking about the willingness and ability of consumers to pay for something. The phrase willingness and ability is kind of long, and so economists often abbreviate it by just saying willingness to pay. But willingness to pay is just an abbreviation for willingness and ability to pay. In neoclassical microeconomics, the demand curve always reflects the income of the consumers. And therefore, if you say, for example, if an economist says the willingness to pay by poor people is quite small, that doesn't say anything, or doesn't say very much about their preferences. What it says is that it's actually their ability to pay that's quite small for something. So don't misinterpret the phrase willingness to pay as meaning merely willingness to pay. It also means ability to pay. So how much are consumers willing and able to pay for Q1 under whatever circumstance I can think of that would induce them to pay more than any other kind of circumstance? The circumstance is the following pretty artificial situation. But we're going through a thought experiment, and so it's quite useful for that. Suppose that instead of a competitive market or a monopoly, instead of a kind of market that we always studied before, where consumers faced one price, the good is auctioned off by an auctioneer who's hired by the firms. And this is what he says. He starts out by saying, the firms who have hired me to auction off this commodity are not very interested in auctioning off the commodity, and are not very interested in producing much of this, and they're only going to produce QA units of the commodity. Given that only QA is going to be available, what would you guys like to bid for it? How much would you all like to pay for it? And then he opens up an auction, and you know what the result is going to be. The result is going to be this. I'll pause it so I can graph it. It's going to be that price, and the revenue that changes hands during that auction. In other words, the revenue that the auctioneer generates from the auction is given by this rectangle. It's the quantity times the price. So the auctioneer receives this revenue for the firms for auctioning off QA. So everybody thinks the auction's over. The people who won the auction pay their money and collect QA. The other people walk away with no QA. And just about the time that everybody's going to head out the door, the auctioneer says, wait a minute. Actually, I lied. The firms who hired me are actually willing to produce, or have already produced, QB units of this commodity. Now, the contracts that we've already signed are binding. So if you already paid price PA and you got some of the QA units that I was selling first, then we don't undo those trades. But if anybody wants to bid on this extra amount I've got, QB minus QA, you're welcome to. Well, you know what'll happen there. To determine the price in the second auction, you start out at QB and you go to the demand curve like this. And then the amount of money that changes hands would be that price, which I'll call PB, times the quantity that changes hands in the second auction, which is QB minus QA. Now, when the people who paid PA hear about the second auction, they're not happy, because they now realize if they had waited until the second auction, then they could have gotten the object at a price of PB, which is less than PA. But the point is that the contracts that were signed at a price of PA were voluntary contracts. The auctioneer had no power to force anybody to do anything. So the quantity QA must have been worth at least PA to the people who bought at a price of PA, because nobody was forcing them to buy it. They could have just walked away. And they chose to buy it even when the price is PA, so it must have been worth at least PA, that is PA or more, to them. So the fact that they are disappointed now that there's a second auction and the price is PB is irrelevant vis-a-vis the conclusion that it was worth PA to those people. The people who bought in the second auction have a lower valuation for the good. They weren't buying it at PA. Of course, some people might have bought some at PA and some at PB, and then what we say is that their valuation of the first few quantities was PA, but their valuation of the remaining quantity was not as high as PA, and so they didn't buy it when the price was PA, but they did decide to buy it when the price was PB. So at the conclusion of the second auction, binding contracts are signed. QB minus QA is distributed to the people who were willing to pay PB. Everybody decides to leave, and the auctioneer says, actually, I lied again. The firms that I represent are willing to produce QC units of the good. Does anybody want to buy it? Let's have another auction. So you know what the result of this auction is going to be. Here's the price. And the amount of money that changes hands is this. Binding contracts are signed to sell at a price of PC, the quantity QC, and you know what's going to happen. Although what we have to assume is that, and this isn't realistic, but the whole thing is not supposed to be realistic. We assume that the people in the room don't know what's going to happen. What happens is that the auctioneer again announces that he lied, that actually QD units are available for sale, and he has an auction for that, and then QE and QF and QG, and so it goes all the way until you get to Q1. Each one of these auctions is a surprise. The consumers don't realize that all this stuff is going to be auctioned off. They think that every auction is going to be the last auction, and they voluntarily, all the trades are voluntary. So if we graph how much money changes hands in each one of these auctions, we get all of this. Suppose instead, since after all we're not being completely realistic here, that instead of having, let's see, how many auctions did I have before? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Instead of 8 auctions, I have an infinite number of auctions. I can run an infinite number of auctions where each auction auctions off an infinitesimally small amount of Q. Then you can see that the amount of money that consumers overall voluntarily transfer to the auctioneer, to the sellers, is going to be it's going to be this whole area under the demand curve. In other words, these little triangular areas here and here and here and here and here. These triangular areas are artifacts of the fact that the auctions aren't infinitesimal. And if you can have an infinitely large number of infinitesimally small auctions, those triangular areas go away, and the auctioneer captures the entire amount under the demand curve. So the interpretation is this is the amount of money consumers are willing and able to pay for Q1. And by Q1, I don't here mean the marginal Q1. I mean the total amount of Q1 units in total. So that's the value of Q1 to these consumers. It's the amount of money that they are willing and able to pay for it. Suppose that we had a normal kind of market where there's only one price for Q1. It's the market clearing price, P1. Consumers would only have to pay P1 for the Q1 units. And here now, I'm not talking necessarily about competition. Even with monopoly, a monopolist charges us one price to everybody. It's a higher price than what the competitive industry charges, but it's just one price. So what I've drawn here is the amount of money that consumers are going to have to pay if they face just one price. How much money would they have been willing and able to pay? They would have been willing and able to pay this much money. So they would have been willing and able to pay a large amount of money to get Q1. But if they only face one price, then they only have to pay the rectangular area. Which means that there's a bonus that this area bounded by the three green circles, I think I'll mark it, represents a bonus. It shows the difference between the amount that they'd be willing and able to pay for Q1 and the amount that they actually have to pay. So now I've typed what I just was going to describe, that the green area represents the excess of, on the one hand, what consumers would be willing and able to pay, over, on the other hand, what consumers have to pay if they only face one price. Let me clarify the one price comment a little bit more. On the left-hand side with the auction, the consumers are facing lots of different prices, PA, PB, PC, and so forth. The diagram I've drawn on the lower right is just one price, P1. So that's why I say that the P1 situation is when they only have to pay one price, like if they face a monopolist or a competitive industry. And the purple situation is like the auctions. That shows if they actually face an infinite number of prices at different times, how much they'd be willing and able to pay. And the difference between those, this green area, is basically a bonus that they get if they only have to face one price. Even if it's a price charged by a monopolist, if they only have to face one price, it's a lot better than having to face this infinite number of prices dictated by an auctioneer who's trying to get the maximum money for the firms. Because if you had the auctioneer, then the consumers would have to hand over everything that they'd be willing and able to pay. If they only have to face one price, they don't have to hand over everything that they'd be willing and able to pay. They get to hand over less than that. They get to hand over just the rectangular area. And so the bonus that they receive when they only have to face one price is this green area. And this green area has a name. The green area is called consumer surplus. So that's the definition of consumer surplus. The excess of what consumers would be willing and able to pay over what they have to pay if they only face one price. In all the market structures that we're going to be studying, both competition and monopoly, consumers only face one price. And therefore, with every transaction, there's a consumer surplus that they enjoy. And let's clarify where the consumer surplus is. The consumer surplus is it's below the demand curve and above the price line. By which I mean, so below the demand curve is below the demand curve here. And above the price line, P1 is the price line, so above the price line here. So that's the location of consumer surplus, below the demand curve and above the price line. That's really key because you do need to know the definition of consumer surplus here. That's what consumer surplus is, but it's also quite important for you to be able to pick out the consumer surplus on a graph. And for that, you need this interpretation of consumer surplus. Below the demand curve and above the price line. Don't forget that.